Okay, here we go. Back for chapter 1. The critic as artist and vice versa. What is a critic? If you ask around or read some of my mail, you will learn that a critic is, above all, a failed artist, unloading long simmering envious resentments on those who had the luck, talent, or discipline to succeed. This assumption is so widespread as to amount to an article of public faith. Every working critic could easily assemble, from discarded letters and deleted emails, a suite of variations on the themes of "you're just jealous" and "I'd like to see you do better." In response, it can always be noted, immodestly, and therefore not always persuasively, that history provides empirical biographical evidence to the contrary. An extensive roster of important critics who were also masters of various arts. In the mid-19th century, Charles Baudelaire wrote brilliantly about modern painting without harming either his skills or his standing as a poet. In the second half of the 20th, John Ashbery and Frank O'Hara did the same. Philip Larkin, another poet, wrote ardently and insightfully, albeit with a touch of his habitual grumpiness, about jazz. Hector Berlioz was a preeminent music critic as well as a great composer. George Bernard Shaw was both one of the greatest English language drama critics and one of the greatest English language dramatists of his time. Le Corbusier's writings about architecture have been at least as influential as his buildings and are perhaps more accommodating. The key directors of the French New Wave, Jean-Luc Godard, Eric Romer, Claude Chabrol, Francois Truffaut, started out as film critics associated with the journal Cahiers du Cinéma. Most of the significant critics of poetry since at least the Romantic era have also been poets, and a few, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, T.S. Eliot, have attained canonical stature in both forms. So there. But the defensive critic may be compelled to admit that such figures are outliers, exceptions that prove a deeply embedded rule. The rule is upheld by the obvious and apparently immutable hierarchical distinction between what critics and artists do. One person may do both, but there is little doubt about where the real value, the real work, resides. The novels are okay, but it's the book reviews that really stand out. Is it possible to imagine fainter, more damning praise? The writers and poets of whom this can be said belong mostly to the ranks of the minor and the almost memorable, providing thesis fodder for intrepid graduate students and waiting in the shadows with gray, stoical patience for a moment of reassessment and rediscovery. The number of critics who have managed to last, to claim, on the basis of their critical writing alone, a foothold on Parnassus or a spot in the canon, is vanishingly small. This is no doubt because criticism is understood to be a time-bound, reactive, secondary activity, stealing whatever temporary prestige, importance, or shock value it has from the durable labor of real artists. As their art persists beyond the difficult moment of its birth, it leaves behind not only the original responses it provoked, but also the world that spawned those responses. Moving toward its future, from the church altar to the museum, from the bookseller's stall to the classroom, from the concert hall to the recording studio, from the rundown Times Square grindhouse to the Criterion Collection DVD box, from the ragged domain of physical artifacts to the seamless digital archive, the work acquires new admirers, fresh skeptics, and calls forth interpretations that discern previously unsuspected meanings and pleasures within its familiar contours. Art, in other words, is durable and mutable, whereas criticism is fixed and therefore perishable. The job of criticism is to be about art. The job of art is just to be. Criticism, in this view, is at best helpful and disposable, an inessential, changeable prop, like the temporary partition in the gallery on which a painting is hung, or the cover slapped on a paperback edition of a classic book. Useful, perhaps, but basically superfluous. And it is always a small step from recognizing that we can live without criticism to deciding that we should. I'm going to reread that. And it is always a small step from recognizing that we can live without criticism to deciding that we should. In the opening pages of Real Presences, his study of the unacknowledged imitations of divinity in secular culture, George Steiner envisions a utopia, a, quote, counter-Platonic republic, end quote, in which all talk about the arts, music, and literature is prohibited, and from which the reviewer and the critic have been banished. That Steiner is himself a critic of considerable renown is not a sign of bad faith, but rather of idealism, of a determination at least to imagine a cultural situation unburdened by the dominance of the secondary and the parasitic that defines our unhappy present condition. Steiner's attack on criticism is a defense of art. This is not a matter of taking up arms against individual critics who spitefully or callously wound the feelings of particular artists, but of a more profound antagonism, the response to a more systemic threat of harm. In Steiner's view, and in the view of many others who share his prejudices, even if they lack his learning, criticism is a pernicious, parasitic growth on the mighty trunk of human creativity. At least in the fantasies of anti-critical ideologues, who are often professional critics themselves, the glories of creation can only be apprehended if those distorting excrescences, that's a fun word to say out loud, are cleared away. It is a mortal, existential struggle. If art is to live, criticism must die, they say. Oh, here he comes. But exactly the opposite is true. It is my contention here that criticism, far from sapping the vitality of art, is instead what supplies its lifeblood. That criticism, properly understood, is not an enemy from which art must be defended, but rather another name, the proper name, for the defense of art itself. Let me go further. Criticism is art's late-born twin. They draw strength and identity from a single source, even if, like most siblings, their mutual dependency is frequently cloaked in rivalry and suspicion. Will it sound defensive or pretentious if I say that criticism is an art in its own right? Not in the narrow quotidian sense in which art is more or less synonymous with skill, but in the grand, fully exalted, romantic meaning of the word. That a critic is a craftsman of sorts is obvious enough. I want to insist that the critic is also a creator. And if my own workmanlike efforts are inadequate to support this assertion, because look, I was on deadline and the editor cut the best parts and nobody understands me anyway, let me fall back temporarily on an argument from authority. H.L. Mencken, the sage of Baltimore and the scourge of all that was phony and flabby in American culture in the first half of the 20th century, declared that any good critic was acting not from the motive of the pedagogue, but the motive of the artist. Rebutting the popular misconception that the critic writes because he is possessed by a passion to advance enlightenment, to put down error and wrong, to disseminate some specific doctrine, in short, to make arguments, he proposed a much more basic impulse. What motivates the critic is no more and no less than the simple desire to function freely and beautifully, to give outward and objective form to ideas that bubble inwardly and have a fascinating lure in them, to get rid of them dramatically and make an articulate noise in the world. Exactly. This blithe assertion of intellectual and creative autonomy, supported by the bravura and insight of which Mencken at his best was capable, and by the permanent spot he managed to claim in the American literary pantheon, is complicated by the nature of the particular art form Mencken's notional critic pursues. The contradictory heart of the matter is that criticism is an art produced in reference to, and therefore in conflict with, other arts. T.S. Eliot, who did not hesitate to associate criticism with the other fine arts, also noted its exceptional status, its essential difference from its siblings. He liked to describe art, in particular poetry, which he favored not only for vocational reasons, but also in deference to its traditional position of supremacy in Western aesthetics, as autotelic, meaning self-completing or self-sufficient. A poem, a statue, or a piece of music is essentially, supposedly, independent, freestanding, whereas any specimen of the art of criticism, however dazzling in itself, must always lean upon and make reference to something else. This makes criticism an anomaly. It may be true that art is born of a struggle with the hard facts of life and the obduracy of the materials at hand, but the struggle does not really involve personal, mutual hostility. The sculptor is not the enemy of the stone. The painter is not in competition with the human form. The key of G will not take umbrage at a composer's use of it. Words do not hate poets. But criticism, as Mencken notes, is different, in part because it is, or seems, personal. When the critic sits down to compose his criticism, his artist ceases to be a friend and becomes mere raw material for his work of art. It is my experience that artists invariably resent this cavalier use of them. They are pleased so long as the critic confines himself to the modest business of interpreting them, preferably in terms of their own estimate of themselves. But the moment he proceeds to adorn their theme with variations of his own, the moment he brings new ideas to the enterprise and begins contrasting them with their ideas, that moment they grow restive. It is precisely at this point, of course, that criticism becomes genuine criticism. Before that, it was mere reviewing. When a critic passes it, he loses his friends. By becoming an artist, he becomes the foe of all other artists. Mencken's conclusion is that the state of hostilities is ultimately beneficial to all concerned. Literature always thrives best, in fact, in an atmosphere of hearty strife. Agreed, and so do all the other arts. Criticism is the art that contends against them for their own benefit, and also to further its own aesthetic ends, to make its articulate noise in the world. This means that criticism, far from being a minor, petty, secondary art, is in fact larger than the others. There is more of it. Its scope is wider. Its methods more eclectic than any of its rivals. It encompasses all of them and compels them all to serve its needs. It is not parasitic, but primary. I know what this sounds like. Sophistry, vain hyperbole, sheer arrogant nonsense. In the sense that Mencken understood and practiced it, criticism is a relatively new and limited pursuit. And throughout human history, a great many artistic traditions have flourished entirely untouched by what we or Mencken would identify as criticism. No cartouche has been unearthed suggesting the existence of an Egyptian sage urging the public not to miss the pyramids. They were even harder to miss then than they are now. Scribes and calligraphers in the ages before newspaper and magazines did not have the time or inclination to jot down and copy responses to the latest madrigal or altarpiece. Wandering through museum galleries, we can be moved and delighted by African masks, Greek vases, and Chinese scrolls without knowing, in some cases, without even being able to guess what contemporary local savants might have made of them. But we can also be sure that these objects and experiences did not make their way to us without passing through a process of judgmental scrutiny that began at the moment of their conception and that informed every stage of their gestation. Every made thing answers to, which is also to say that it struggles against and sometimes transcends, aesthetic norms and cultural purposes that are implicit within it even as they may be inscrutable to late arriving or alien eyes. A work of art is itself a piece of criticism. The purpose of George Steiner's thought experiment, his peremptory sweeping away of the fog of commentary that he sees shrouding the finest products of all the human imagination, is to clarify exactly this point. All serious art, music, and literature, he writes, is a critical act, by which he means not only that art in general constitutes a criticism of life, in Matthew Arnold's phrase, but also that the arts embody an expository reflection on, a value judgment of, the inheritance and context to which they pertain. This is a starchy, pseudo-Germanic way of noting that, far from existing in a state of serene, autotelic isolation, works of art reach beyond themselves, engaging other works that exist alongside and before them, and the historical circumstances in which they arise. On one level, the point is so obvious that it hardly needs arguing. Libraries, course syllabi, museums, and the iTunes store are all organized around a belief in the organic existence of genres, traditions, periods, and other forms of artistic affiliation. We are routinely taught to attend to context, an agreeably vague term for the stuff we might want to know about the thing we're looking at, and also, more precisely, for the stuff that thing seems to know. We might still cling to the myth of the solitary creator, toiling in a garret, awaiting a visit from the muse, but the reality of creation has always been much more interactive. Not simply because an individual painter or writer is likely, however cantankerously or reluctantly, to be part of a scene or a school, or even because of the essentially collaborative, collective nature of pursuits like theater, film, architecture, and music. All art that is recognizable as such is in some degree about other art. Every writer is a reader, every musician a listener, driven by a desire to imitate, to correct, to improve, or to answer the models before them. It would be too much to say that every artist is a failed critic, unable to appreciate what already exists without adding to it. But it does not seem to be inaccurate to say that all art is successful criticism. It is a simple, practical observation, but I also want to gesture toward what I take to be a vaster and more fundamental truth. We are accustomed in the post-everything present to an aesthetic of the sample, the mashup, and the pastiche. For several decades now, an era marked by hip-hop appropriation, self-ironizing television shows, literary parody, and cinematic homage, culture has thrived on various styles of borrowing, quotation, and meta-commentary, much of it bracingly original. At worst, we have been subjected to tiresome and cynical bouts of remaking and recycling. But what is more striking is the sheer novelty that so often emerges from the contemplation and reinvention of the old. Hip-hop is perhaps the supreme example of this apparent paradox, an authentically and at times radically new musical idiom built from the stolen beats and blended sounds of antecedent forms. Similar practices of nodding and winking, spoofing and honoring, remixing and repurposing have a way of popping up wherever our gazes happen to land. Filmmakers like Quentin Tarantino and Joel and Ethan Coen, to cite only two of the better-known cases, mine the movie past to make films that are saturated in history without quite resembling anything that has come before. Visual art since the 1980s, when Andy Warhol replaced Jackson Pollock as the supreme influence on the young, has aggressively recombined both the iconography and the literal images of earlier times. 100 hothouse flowers have bloomed. Paintings based on paintings, photographs of paintings, and hard to classify, hard to miss artifacts that count as works of art because no other category exists for them. Not everyone is happy about this, of course. There is by now a bursting archive of complaints about the derivative, secondary, unserious aspects, not just of particular works of artists, but of entire art forms, and of the hectically self-conscious, or air-quoting, zeitgeist itself. The situation that Steiner calls our current misère, which to a sensibility less saturnine might look like a whole lot of fun, is often faulted for the ascendancy of hybrids, simulacra, and imitations, secondhand stuff that has crowded out the authentic, heroic, self-authorized masterpieces of yesteryear. But whatever you think about specific trends and tendencies within late 20th century and early 21st century culture, What used to be called postmodern is now just called now. They represent the latest iteration of something as old as art itself. Imitation is not the erosion of originality. It is the condition of originality. History proves as much. The popular culture of the past half-century has been a self-propelling machine for the production of novelty that turns almost instantly into nostalgia. An old song is one that was on the radio 2 summers ago. A classic is the one you dance to at your prom. And the movies and television programs of your childhood are marked with the tints and timbres of antiquarianism. But the thread that connects the generations is a relentless dialectic of copying and reinvention. Every explosion of transformative newness turns out, on closer inspection, to be the recovery and recasting of what was already there, aided by new technology and the eager devotion of fans striving to pay tribute to their idols by mimicking and surpassing them. The story of rock and roll is a chronicle of successive generations of teenagers teaching themselves Chuck Berry riffs and going from there. As soon as the style grows too big or baroque, as soon as the raw essence of the music is obscured by commercial scale or artistic ambition, someone will come along to give the wheel another turn by reinventing it. The iconoclasts of the French New Wave were in thrall to the artistry of Hollywood studio hacks, auteurs in other words, and bewitched by the power of American commercial genres. Jean-Luc Godard's Breathless is a movie without precedent, full of freshness, youthful vigor, and the air of Parisian post-war reality. And yet, it is also almost entirely commentary on American crime cinema going back to the 1930s. And in turn, quite a lot of the most interesting subsequent cinema, from Bonnie and Clyde to Wong Kar-wai, is a commentary on and elaboration of the themes and styles of Breathless. Godard is an exceptional figure, of course, but also, just for that reason, an exemplary one. There has perhaps never been a filmmaker so completely and compulsively obsessed with cinema, as a record of history, a tool for thought, a playpen, and a field of battle. Godard is also a director for whom filmmaking and film criticism are finally indistinguishable. To say that the polemical and appreciative essays he wrote in Cahiers is as a young man, in which he embraced with militant fervor the movies of Howard Hawks, Fritz Lang, Nicholas Ray, and other misunderstood geniuses of the studio system, were a prelude to the investigations of cinematic form carried out in Breathless and beyond, is also to say that those films carried out by other means the investigations begun in print. In his late work, above all, the 8-part, 4.5-hour-long Histoire du Cinéma, this continuity becomes explicit, as the sequence of moving images becomes the ideal medium for thinking about the legacy and the future of motion pictures. Godard's Histoire is a grand anomaly, and also the apotheosis of a familiar genre, the movie about movies. Cinema is a language with built-in reflexive capabilities that other art forms may seem to lack. Music criticism is unlikely to be scored, or art criticism conducted by means of brush and pigment. But it is precisely in those art forms that Godard's epic collage, a counterpoint of borrowed images and meditative narration, finds its strongest precedence. The canon of high literature, fine art, and classical music consists of a long conversation between eras, styles, and nations that is at times covert rather than explicit, but that is always there. Some of the principal monuments of literary modernism, James Joyce's Ulysses, Ezra Pound's Cantos, Eliot's The Wasteland, are brand new tapestries woven out of ancient thread. And some of the most radical innovations of the 19th and 20th century avant-garde are acts of recovery and reinterpretation. Pound's exhortation to make it new, an enduring and perennially refreshable modernist slogan, presumes the existence of that all-important it, which is to say, everything that the frigate of human civilization has left in its wake. The new does not occur in a vacuum. It requires materials, and the revolutionary impulse that swept in successive waves across the arts from the middle of the 19th century to the middle of the 20th involved the compulsive excavation of such materials for rescue, correction, and adaptation. Manet, the first great modern painter, may have been responding to the social tumults of Paris in the 1860s and 70s. But he was also conducting a passionate argument with Titian and Velázquez and the tradition of European painting, attempting to recover the sources of its vitality and give them currency in his own changed milieu. Picasso, coming a little more than a generation after Manet, began his career with an extensive inquiry into his native tradition, evoking Goya, Velázquez, El Greco, and other Spanish masters in his early paintings. As his ambition grew, he radically expanded his field of influences to include, most decisively, the African masks and figures that inspired Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, and the Greek vase decorations that informed his mischievously erotic late drawings and etchings. His intent was not to quote or to appropriate, or to flatter the cleverness of beholders who might get the references, but rather to find a vocabulary of images and techniques able to infuse his own work with the primal, authentic power he desired. The itineraries of modernism passed through the old, the archaic, the ancient, the atavistic, en route to the new. Similarly, European and American modernisms trafficked in the exotic, the primitive, the alien, the strange, in their search for the immediate and the essential, for that elusive quality that would shake painting, poetry, and music out of their inherited patterns and complacent assumptions. To some degree, this was all a response to the feeling of belatedness that shadows the experience of modernity. The world, as found by its restless modern spirits, is already crowded, its most fertile areas already carefully farmed or wildly overgrown. The only way forward, seems to be back and through. But it may be that modern in this instance, but it may mean that by modern in this instance, we really mean something closer to human. The felt imperative to make it new is itself not so new. Making it new is pretty much the way it's always been done. Lateness, that sinking feeling that originality has been exhausted and that only repetition remains, has weighed on the souls of artists since the beginning. The great originator of English letters, Shakespeare himself, ransacked the cupboards of high and low literature, history, and folklore in search of viable scenarios, cobbling scraps of Ovid, Holinshead, Latin comedy, Commedia dell'arte sketches, and medieval fairy tales into an imposing and profligate edifice that nearly every subsequent writer of English, American, Irish, African, Caribbean, Indian, would feel free to pillage. There are different ways of imagining this continual process of ransacking and remaking, which determines the specific course of each art form over time. Apprentices school themselves in the work of the masters, breaking down the mysteries of earlier achievements into techniques that can be imitated and adapted. The fundamental critical process, the hinge that conjoins the twin activities of creation and analysis, may reside on this basic activity of loving demystification. To revert to an earlier example, you hear Chuck Berry on the radio, and your pleasure at the sound is redoubled by an impulse that is compounded of envy, admiration, and desire. I want to do that. How did he do that? Maybe I could do it better. The budding cineast Jean-Luc Godard at the Paris Cinématique, craning forward in the first row to catch the image as soon as it bounces off the screen. Martin Scorsese raptly taking in a double feature in the Manhattan of his youth, dreams of casting a spell like the one he finds himself under. The bookworm, longing for a deeper connection to her literary idols, for their company, mimics their voices until she finds her own. The discipline that turns a fan into an adept, the breaking down of the sound into its constituent notes, the film into its shots, the prose into its defining tonalities, can be acquired at school or in solitude, by direct tutelage or dreamy osmosis. In every case, it involves the transformation of awe into understanding and the claiming of a share of imaginative power. Each of our make-believe fledglings, the rocker, the director, the poet, is also therefore a critic. The stronger they grow, the more autonomous and confident in their mastery of the art in question, the more decisively critical their efforts become, until they succeed in reversing the direction of influence and altering the work of their predecessors. Chuck Berry sounds different after the Beach Boys, Bruce Springsteen, and the Sex Pistols. They all take it upon themselves to finish what he started, even if, exactly because, it had seemed self-sufficiently done to begin with. Godard, the disciple of Hitchcock and Hawks, is also their interpreter, as Tarantino will be his. The past, according to T.S. Eliot, is altered by the present, as much as the present is directed by the past. Eliot's word for this looping temporal relationship between the old and the new is tradition, a term that was in his time, as in ours, somewhat suspect. It can mean a slavish, timid reliance on pre-existing models, or else a way of doing things hemmed in by conservative, ethnocentric assumptions. But his understanding of tradition is less restrictive and more dynamic than his subsequent repudiation as an imperious conservative might suggest. The idea of tradition is what allows us to perceive patterns and affinities over time, and to acknowledge that no poet, no artist of any art, has his complete meaning alone. His significance is the appreciation of his relation to the dead poets and artists. Morbid as this may sound, it identifies two crucial components of artistic ambition: the desire to last, to have at least a chance at immortality, and the anxious wish to measure up, to elbow one's way into the company that does not require your presence. The existing order is complete, Eliot declares, before the new work arrives, which is both discouraging and realistic. There is never at any moment a need for more. Chuck Berry does not require Bruce Springsteen. Velázquez can do without Picasso or Manet. But there is always, at the same time, the imperative to continue, to correct, to improve, to repeat, and thereby to change the character of everything that has come before. For order to persist after the supervention of novelty, the whole existing order must be, if ever so slightly, altered. Whether in the end such an order really exists, and whether its existence undermines the autotelic completeness that Eliot elsewhere projects onto any successful individual work, has already been a matter of intense historical and ideological debate. Eliot is talking about European high culture in a prescriptive, defensive tone that presses all kinds of hot buttons, and making a big deal about the necessary impersonality of literary creation. It is therefore easy to miss that his real interest, in the essay I have been quoting, published shortly after the end of World War I, when its author, still in his early 30s, was far from literary grand poobah he would become, is in what it feels like to be an eager young artist looking for a place to stand in a field crowded with the monuments and muddy footprints of the great. How to make room for yourself. How to make it appear to yourself first of all, but then to everyone else, as if you belong. These are the kinds of questions that underlie Harold Bloom's idea of influence, a version of tradition that replaces Eliot's ideal order with the passion and tumult of contending personalities and errant meanings. Poetic influence, according to Bloom, always proceeds by a misreading of the prior poet, an act of creative correction that is actually and necessarily a misinterpretation. The history of fruitful poetic influence, which is to say the main tradition of Western poetry since the Renaissance, is a history of anxiety and self-saving caricature, of distortion, of perverse, willful revisionism, without which modern poetry as such could not exist. Anyone who has not encountered Bloom's own marvelously willful and perverse readings in this tradition, in a series of books, the shortest and grandest of which is The Anxiety of Influence, should be sure to seek them out. Literary criticism has rarely been practiced with such a combination of learning and drama, as the designated strong poets grapple with each other in a struggle that seems primal rather than modern in its intensity. Part of what is at stake in that struggle is the assertion of primacy. Not just one poet outdoing another, but more radically shaking off the stigma of coming afterward and laying claim to originality, to independence, to an authority that makes the rest of the tradition irrelevant. Not all art explicitly proceeds from such a grandiose motive, but very little of it is produced without reference to some idea of greatness, usually one that involves the transcendence of precedent. It goes without saying that the sorry fate of most art is to fall into imitative mediocrity, failing even to live up to the available models. It may seem as if I am enclosing art, along with criticism, in a familiar corral of self-reference, an airless theoretical space in which poets write to, about, and through other poets. Movies make obsessive allusion to other movies, and every song is an echo of another song. But what I am really trying to do is zero in on the existential paradox of art itself, which springs out of an urge to master and add something to reality, and finds itself immediately confronted with obstacles that are also its available tools. This urge is very old. There is no record of its first occurrence, and also apparently inexhaustible. To understand it requires the resources of science and the inventions of myth. Okay, we're going to finish this chapter and then be done for tonight. In Plato's Symposium, the supposed transcript of a philosophical Athenian drinking party that prophetically parodies the panel discussions and think tank roundtables of later times, the comic playwright Aristophanes offers a fable about the origin of love. In our own day, the fable has been retold in song by Stephen Trask in the musical Hedwig and the Angry Itch. It is a preposterous and touching story about the destruction of a primordial proto-human race of roly-poly, four-legged, Janus-faced creatures, each one endowed with two sets of genitals. Instead of two sexes, there used to be three, all male, all female, and androgynous. But there was not really any sexuality as we know it, since each body was complete unto itself. One day Zeus, in a fit of Olympian jealousy, split our ancestors in two with lightning bolts. And ever since then, each member of our broken species has been tormented by the desire to recover his or her missing half. Our coupling is the clumsy, desperate, occasionally successful attempt to put it back together, what divine violence broke apart. In addition to regaling his friends with a fanciful and metaphorically persuasive account of the human libido, Aristophanes touches, in them and in subsequent readers of the Symposium, a deeply resonant, imaginative chord, one that sounds across cultures and historical eras. So much of our striving, in love, religion, art, and work, seems to be undertaken out of a longing, overtly expressed or not, to restore a sense of wholeness. Once, just beyond the boundary of living memory or recorded history, we were complete. Now we are damaged, fallen, deformed. Often, as in the book of Genesis and its later elaborations, what brought us down was our own arrogance or ambition. According to Aristophanes, Zeus was impelled to dissect us because, as whole, self-sufficient quadrupeds, we threatened the supremacy he and the other immortals had enjoyed since they overthrew the Titans. A more famous myth, chronicled long before Plato's time by the poet Hesiod, similarly situates human origins in a scene of conflict with the gods. The Titan Prometheus, who possessed an intricate and twisting mind, and who enjoyed punking the haughty and humorless Zeus, concealed fire in a fennel stalk and delivered it to mankind. For this transgression, Prometheus was chained to a rock to be preyed upon forever by an eagle. For our part, as punishment for accepting his gift, we received a box of woes, delivered to us by a kind of robot woman, fashioned by the collective artifice of all the gods, called Pandora. Since before this time, Hesiod recounts in the Works and Days, the races of men had been living on earth, free from all evils, free from laborious work, and free from all wearing sicknesses. So the possession of fire brought about a fall into the world of suffering and vexation we now inhabit, a world leavened by fleeting imitations of hope, the one thing that remained inside Pandora's box. In later antiquity, in the plays of Aeschylus, for example, during the Renaissance and even more so in the Romantic period, Prometheus was often regarded as a heroic, revolutionary figure. To Percy Bysshe Shelley, he represents the type of the highest perfection of moral and intellectual nature, impelled by the purest and truest motives to the best and noblest ends, both the progenitor of human genius and its incarnate ideal. In Shelley's Prometheus Unbound, he is the champion of mankind while Zeus is the oppressor. And Zeus's punishment of Prometheus is both a terrible, tragic injustice and a prelude to redemption. For Hesiod, though, Prometheus is a thief and a liar who got what he deserved, leaving his human protégés an unhappy legacy of limited power and pervasive suffering. The moral Shelley extracts from his story is that anything is possible, that the sacred fire of freedom is within our grasp. Hesiod reaches the opposite conclusion. So there is no way to avoid what Zeus has intended. To illustrate this fatalistic point, he unspooled a longer, even more pessimistic outline of human history. The narrative, not of a precipitous fall, but rather of a slow, implacable decline, brightened by a few glimmers of hope. There was, at the dawn of human life, a golden age, followed by the ages of silver and bronze, and then by an age of heroes, during which the Trojan War was fought, all of them leading to the present age of iron, where Hesiod and his listeners find themselves. It is not a happy place. Never by daytime will there be an end to work and pain, nor in the night to weariness, when the gods will send anxieties to trouble us. Apart from the polytheistic superstition, this sounds curiously modern, and much of the Works and Days resembles the most modern of genres, the self-help book, albeit in a kind of melancholy resignation rather than peppy optimism. It is a guide to coping with the stresses and challenges of daily life that combines practical advice with spiritual insight, a compendium of folk wisdom colored by a weary pessimism that is both touching and disconcerting. A 21st century reader, accustomed to living with feelings of belatedness and perhaps susceptible to nostalgic visions of golden ages past, might be startled to discover that same malaise settling over a work that is one of the earliest monuments of Western literature, a heroic poem roughly contemporary with the Odyssey and the Iliad. Before anything had really gotten started, everything already sucked, which is exactly Hesiod's point. We labor under a divine curse. The serial myths of origin and history he relates in the Works and Days and also in its companion, Theogony, comprise of an anthology of exile and punishment, hubris and calamity. We retell these stories in order to be humbled and chastened, but also as an inspiration to try again, to recover the loss and repair the damage, or at least, following in the plodding footsteps of the Works and Days, to keep going. But every attempt to overcome our condition, whether through momentary consolations or utopian projects, serves inevitably to remind us of it. To the extent that we are inclined to seek perfection, we are bound to fail. And out of a combination of morbid discontent and stubborn idealism, we are compelled to collapse. I am having trouble with that sentence. Starting again. To the extent that we are inclined to seek perfection, we are bound to fail. And out of a combination of morbid discontent and stubborn idealism, we are compelled to calibrate as precisely as possible the nature and extent of the failure. Our creativity originates in anguish and longing, and our creations, when we contemplate them, seem alien and mysterious. We become morbidly aware of their flaws and infelicities, and almost reflexively note the way they fall short of the ideal. We doubt their value and question their meaning, and find ourselves by turns enthralled and puzzled by their power. This is an essentially tragic account of the origin of art, and also implicitly of criticism. since criticism finds its home in the shadow that falls between intention and act, between the inspiration and the inevitably disappointing work that emerges from it. Our drive to create originates in, and compensates for, a primal feeling of alienation, of lostness in the universe, and confusion about our identity. Frequently aligned with that sense of our original inadequacy is, somewhat paradoxically, a perception of our subsequent decline. The more we do, the further we stray from our sad beginnings, the less heroic we appear to ourselves. It is always the age of iron, and the golden age is always behind us, giving off a luster that illuminates the terminal shabbiness of our present condition. But of course, there is a contrary view, according to which the creative impulse originates in a moment of miraculous discovery and develops progressively toward a horizon of perfection. For Shelley, and before him for Aeschylus, Prometheus was a hero, not a knave, and the emphasis falls not on his theft from the gods, but on his gift to mankind. Art may still appropriate the divine prerogative of making, but it flatters by imitation rather than blaspheming by hubris. In an example of the happy synthesis of pagan and monotheistic traditions that enlivened the thoughts of the Renaissance, Giorgio Vasari begins his Lives of the Artists, an epical compendium of gossip, art history, and celebrity worship, with a theological solution to the riddle of historical beginnings. Where did it all start? Did the Greeks invent art, or the Egyptians, or some other ancient people? There is evidence in the archaeological record to support various theories, but these are ultimately of little more than passing interest to Vasari, who prefers to situate the geniuses of art in the first verses of Genesis. The first artist was God, who, in the act of creating man, fashioned the first forms of painting and sculpture in the sublime grace of created things. It is undeniable that from man, as from a perfect model, statues and pieces of sculpture and the challenges of pose and contour were first derived. And for the first paintings, whatever they may have been, the ideas of softness and of unity and the clashing harmony made by light and shadow were derived from the same source. Part of the charm of this passage is its elegant solution to a vexing chicken and egg problem. Is art primarily the imitation of nature, driven by the desire to replicate what the eye sees in the world? Or does it always consist of the imitation of some other prior art? Vasari's answer is both, since nature itself is, quite literally and specifically, a work of art, fashioned of the same substances that later artists will use to capture it. The first creator worked in clay, stone, light, and color, and his followers will not only render what he made, but also reproduce it on an appropriately modest scale in similar media. The great painters are like demigods, exerting an influence almost equal to the divine original. In my opinion, Vasari writes, painters owe to Giotto, the Florentine painter, exactly the same debt they owe to nature, which constantly serves them as a model, and whose finest and most beautiful aspects they are always striving to imitate and reproduce. Giotto himself, though he was discovered and tutored by the older painter Cimabue, I don't know who that person is, and I'm not sure if that name is Italian, but anyway, learned directly from the source. According to legend, Giotto was a peasant's son whose first works, the ones that caught his mentor's eye, were pictures of grazing sheep scratched with one stone on another. It is hard to imagine a less alienated account of the origin of art, and Vasari's book, a compendium of chronologically ordered biographical sketches of Italian artists from Cimabue to Michelangelo, that sometimes reads like mash notes from the world's biggest painting fanfic, is one of the happiest, most unabashedly positive works of criticism ever written. It helped that Vasari, himself a well-connected painter and architect, had an abundance of good material to work with. He was able to survey without straining a golden age of incomparable richness. The roughly 300 years of history he covers, from the 1200s to the mid-1500s, invite a progressive evolutionary narrative of continual refinement and improvement. Art, for Vasari, is always tending toward perfection, and the art of the Italian peninsula, moving out of the Middle Ages, discovers new technical resources as it develops. Vasari notes the elements of this progress: advances in the accurate representation of human anatomy and skin tone, the deepening of perspective, the growing dynamism of composition, and concludes that they combine to make modern art even more glorious than that of the ancient world. You can argue that your own modern art is far less glorious than his, but my point about Vasari here is that he presents a non-tragic, anti-declinist story of the origin and growth of art. Not that it's a matter of choosing between the happy and the sad versions of the story. There's always plenty of evidence to support both optimism and pessimism, which coexist in counterpoint at every moment of history and within the conflicted sensibilities of every generation. In our own time, we prefer to look for clues about our origins in science rather than myth or religion. How did a peculiarly human propensity for making, for distilling harmony from noise, pictures from marks, stories from words, emotions from make-believe, come about? What function did it serve for our ancestors as they tried to survive and reproduce? Is there a hidden utility in the pleasure and beauty, or even the confusion and terror, we discern in the arts? Rich and seemingly boundless as the creative arts seem to be, the biologist E.O. Wilson writes, each is filtered through the narrow biological channels of human cognition. Moreover, the creative arts became possible as an evolutionary advantage when humans developed the capacity for abstract thought. This was, we might say, the Promethean moment, the moment lost to all recollection and possibly to empirical recovery, when we became conscious of our enormous power and also of our limitations. We found ourselves able to make things and also, as a consequence, to judge them. Not unlike the original critic in Genesis, who cast his eye over what he had made and decided it was good. How did he know? All right, enough for tonight. More tomorrow.